In this video, I'll make a simple clipboard with a magnetic flap. Thin, strong magnets have a lot of creative potential in bookbinding and box making. I'm sure this project could be adapted to many uses. I got the idea for this project when the Queensland Bookbinders Guild visited the commercial bookbinder Books and Boxes. The owner, Daniel Ibbott, was showing us some samples of their work, and one was a menu holder with a flap at the top with magnets for closure. I stole this idea completely. But not everyone needs a menu holder at home, unless your family meals are much fancier than in the Daz household, so a clipboard is probably a more practical use. But watch out for the small enhancement I make at the end of the video. You'll recognise the design as the cover board for the Screw Post album. This is a great thing about advancing in a craft. The techniques you learn can be reused in other projects. Eventually, new projects are made completely with techniques you're very familiar with, and it all starts to feel easy and fun. No stress wondering if something will work. And that is where we all want to end up, in a state of flow when even paring leather is calming. I start with 2 pieces of my standard oversized A5 long grain binder's board. This seems a good size and means I save on cutting. For the flap, there are arguments for having the grain direction in either direction. I'm feeling lazy and cut 25mm off a pre-cut piece of board, which means it's short grain. My rationalisation is that it matches the base grain direction and they'll expand and contract in unison. But long grain would have been stiffer. This way saves me a few cuts. I'm going to use 8 10mm round magnets, 4 for the flap and 4 for the base. They were described as 2mm thick, but in reality they're 1.6mm, which is a very close match for my 1.8mm board, which is 1.7mm thick. I use a wad punch to make holes near the end of the flap, and then 2 equally spaced between these. I tape the flap to the base and punch through the holes to locate them. I just make a mark and then take the flap off to finish punching to avoid opening up the flap holes more. I'm making a video about how to sharpen these wad punches. If you're not familiar with them, I'll give you more details in that video, but the short story is that there are very good ones that are very expensive and cheap ones that don't cut very well and need sharpening. I bought the magnets on eBay from China. The strong magnet market is the Wild West. I have no confidence in quality control or of the magnets matching technical descriptions such as N53, which is the strongest. The ones I got are described as N50. I couldn't find any thin magnets rated at N53. I'm not a magnet expert and don't know what all this means. It's not really important for this work as long as they're strong enough. They're not going to be used in an aircraft guidance system. I think they're about $6 for 50 magnets, including postage. There's something wrong with that, but let's not get into politics in a bookbinding video. I line the boards with 300 GSM or 10-point card to hide the magnets. You need to keep track of how the flap and the base align, which is easy to lose track of. I line the inside faces first. I make sure the card grain direction matches the board. Well, that's what I should have done. This is one of the downsides to that state of flow. You stop thinking a bit. I always cut the walls of boxes long grain. When possible, this is the best way to do it. Working in autopilot, I cut the card long grain just like if I was lining a box wall. For this small project that's not going to get passed down through the generations, this isn't an issue. I didn't notice until I was editing the video. I put the boards in the press a heap of times for this project, and I usually use this as an excuse to go have a coffee. A 10-second nip is probably all that it needs to crisp everything up. If you don't have a press, don't sweat it. Just put it between a couple of boards and use the weight of a couple of bricks for 30 minutes. The most important step in this project is making sure the polarity of the paired magnets match. I put the 4 base magnets in place first, and then the magnets and the flap sort themselves out. I have a nice snug fit for the magnets and they won't fall out easily. If one does fall out, you need to make sure it goes back in the right way. You could use a Sharpie to mark them. Then I line the other surface with the same card. I glue out the board despite the card being the thinner material. There's little chance of getting wrinkles in the card and it's a little bit less messy this way, and if you do it on both sides, any pull will be cancelled out. But there won't be in this case. The lamination does make it nice and rigid. When I nip it this time, I do put blotters either side of it to try and draw some moisture out. Once I completely cover it with Arbelave, the moisture will be very slow to work its way out. Covering is the same as for the screw post album. I want the flap to be very flexible and to be able to accommodate some material inside of it. Instead of 8mm, I cut a gap gauge 10mm wide. I glue the board in place on an oversized piece of Arbelave before trimming the turn-ins. With the album, the spine turn-in was 60mm wide to cover the flap and the joint. Because of the wider joint in this project, I make it 70mm. In the past, I hardly ever used corner cutting gauges, but since I got the set from Stepan, I've found more uses for them. They're perfect for marking out the flap corners on this project. The standard distance to cut away from a corner is 1.5 board thicknesses. I find the 3.5mm gauge the one I use the most, and would have used here, except I've lost mine. I'm told the small corner magnets for box making are the bomb, especially for small boxes, of course. I'm going to order a set and I can get a replacement 3.5mm corner gauge at the same time. With the album, I worked the cloth into the joint from the outside. For this, I want the cloth equal in from both sides. Here's another tip from Daniel. When pressing something that's uneven, put it between some dense-ish foam. I also cut a couple of pieces of 1mm board slightly narrower than the joint to really force the cloth into that joint. The final construction step is to line the board. For a clipboard, I want it very plain and use the same coloured Arbelave. In this video, I've tried very hard to glue in a way that you could see the head of the brush instead of just the back of my hand. This involves trying to glue at some weird angles, and I still failed, and putting this piece of cloth down and aligning it with some very faint prick marks on dark cloth is hard to do without getting up close and personal, but then I'd block the camera's view. I ended up putting it down slightly crooked and the PVA tacked right away. I couldn't make it slip a millimetre. Because of the matching colours, it's hardly noticeable and I'm not bothered. But for your first few attempts, it might be a good idea to use a mix of PVA and methyl cellulose or paste, which will give you a bit of open time for repositioning. When I noticed my ruler sticking to the back of the clipboard, I wondered if it was strong enough to stick to the fridge. It did, but the bottom stuck out a bit and it was easily knocked off. So I made another version with another 4 magnets at the bottom, and I used 15mm magnets instead of 10. This worked great, and now the Daz household has a deluxe shopping list on the fridge. I was a bit nervous about titling the flap over the magnets, but it worked fine. Thanks for spending time with me today. I hope you think of heaps of ways to use magnets in your projects. There's additional information in the video description, including how you can support the making of more videos like this through Patreon. Until next time, cheerio.